January 17, 1945, Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen earth groaned beneath steel treads. Snow fell in thick curtains across the Ardennes forest, muffling the world into an eerie silence broken only by the metallic grinding of machinery. Through the white veil emerged a column of tanks, 30, 40, perhaps 50, their olive-drab hulls dusted with frost, their star markings barely visible against the winter morning. They moved not with the cautious hesitation of a retreating army, but with the relentless rhythm of a machine that could not be stopped. The Sherman tanks rolled forward, exhaust plumes rising like industrial breath into the bitter air. Inside the lead vehicle, the crew felt the engine's warmth against their backs, heard the familiar clatter of ammunition boxes shifting with each lurch over the uneven ground. They did not speak of victory or glory. They spoke of the next hill, the next village, the next mile, because behind them, stretching back through the snow-laden forests and across the Atlantic itself, was something the German defenders could not comprehend, an endless river of steel flowing from factories that never slept. 3 miles away, in a hastily dug position overlooking the approach road, Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner pressed frozen binoculars against his face. What he saw defied everything he had been taught about warfare. His Tiger tank sat concealed among the trees, its 88mm gun capable of penetrating any Allied armor at 2,000 meters. His crew was veteran, disciplined, survivors of the Eastern Front where they had carved through Soviet T-34s like a scythe through wheat. The Tiger was superior in every technical measure: thicker armor, more powerful gun, better optics. By all accounts of military science, it should dominate this battlefield. Yet Steiner's hands trembled not from the cold, but from the arithmetic of despair. He had destroyed 4 Sherman tanks the previous day. This morning, 8 more had taken their place. Yesterday, his company possessed 5 operational Tigers. Today, 3 remained. Tomorrow, if they were fortunate, perhaps 2 would still function. And still the Shermans came, an endless procession that turned warfare from a contest of skill into a question of simple mathematics. This was not the war Germany had prepared to fight. The Sherman tank entered history not as a masterpiece of engineering, but as an industrial miracle clothed in riveted steel. When the United States Army issued requirements for a new medium tank in 1940, the specifications reflected not theoretical perfection, but pragmatic reality. The design needed to cross bridges built for civilian traffic. It needed to fit aboard cargo ships by the hundreds. It needed to be maintained by mechanics who, 6 months earlier, had been repairing tractors in Iowa or taxicabs in Brooklyn. It needed, above all else, to be manufactured in quantities that would have seemed insane to any military planner of the eerie previous generation. The Wright Continental R975 radial engine was chosen not because it was ideal for a tank, but because it was already in mass production for aircraft. The suspension system borrowed from agricultural and industrial machinery. The transmission could be serviced with tools found in any American auto shop. Every design choice prioritized one principle above all others. This tank would be built not in dozens, but in tens of thousands. The Germans had spent the 1930s crafting the panzer divisions that would slice through Poland and France with surgical precision. Their doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, tactical brilliance, the decisive breakthrough achieved through superior skill and innovative doctrine, quality over quantity, the tank as a surgical instrument in the hands of an expert. When Tiger and Panther tanks entered production, they represented the pinnacle of this philosophy: magnificent weapons requiring skilled craftsmen to build, educated crews to operate, specialized tools to maintain. A single Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to manufacture. Its Maybach engine demanded precision parts machined to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. When something broke, and in the mud and ice of the Eastern Front, something always broke, repairs required specialized components that might take weeks to arrive from German factories already struggling under Allied bombing campaigns. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed to be ordinary. It was built to accept imperfection, to function despite damage, to be repaired by men who learned mechanical skills not through years of apprenticeship, but through weeks of military training. When a Sherman's engine failed, a replacement could be installed in a matter of hours. When its transmission cracked, spare parts existed in depots scattered across every theater of war. The American military had absorbed a fundamental lesson from Henry Ford and the assembly lines of Detroit, that the ability to produce equipment in vast quantities, to replace losses faster than they could accumulate, transformed the entire nature of industrial warfare. A good tank that arrived in overwhelming numbers would defeat an excellent tank that arrived in inadequate supply. In the spring of 1942, as Rommel's Afrika Korps pushed toward the Suez Canal and German armies stood at the gates of Stalingrad, American factories were just beginning their transformation. The Chrysler Corporation converted its tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, running assembly lines 24 hours a day. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors built Sherman hulls in Grand Blanc, Michigan, employing workers who had never seen a military vehicle before Pearl Harbor. The Ford Motor Company produced engines. The American Locomotive Company constructed tanks. The Baldwin Locomotive Works built tanks. The Pressed Steel Car Company built tanks. The Pacific Car and Foundry Company built tanks. What had been manufacturers of automobiles, locomotives, and railway cars became, almost overnight, an arsenal of such magnitude that the German General Staff struggled to credit intelligence reports of American production capacity. The numbers defy easy comprehension. In 1942, American factories produced 24,000 tanks. In 1943, the number rose to 29,000. By 1944, production reached its peak, nearly 30,000 armored fighting vehicles rolling off assembly lines in a single year. The Sherman alone accounted for over 49,000 units produced during the war. To place this in perspective, Germany manufactured approximately 25,000 tanks and self-propelled guns of all types during the entire war. A 6-year struggle against the combined industrial might of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. America built more Sherman tanks in 1 year than Germany built Panzer IVs, their most common medium tank, during the entire conflict. The Reich produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and fewer than 1,400 Tigers. For every German heavy tank that rolled off the production line, 30 Shermans entered service. But mere numbers tell only part of the story. The Sherman's true advantage lay not just in quantity, but in the infrastructure of abundance that supported it. Every Sherman that landed on a European beach came accompanied by a logistical system that German commanders could barely fathom. Spare parts existed in such quantities that American maintenance crews disposed of components German mechanics would have carefully rebuilt. Ammunition arrived in such volumes that American tank commanders fired high-explosive rounds to clear suspicious hedgerows, expending in an afternoon more shells than a German tank company might receive in a month. Fuel flowed through pipelines, tank trucks, and jerry cans in endless streams, while panzer divisions calculated their operations around dwindling reserves that could not be replaced. The diesel fuel that powered German logistics came from synthetic plants that consumed vast quantities of coal and electricity, plants that became priority targets for Allied bombers. By 1944, fuel shortages crippled German armored formations. Tigers and Panthers sat immobilized not from combat damage but from empty fuel tanks, transformed into static pillboxes that would never move again. American Shermans, by contrast, operated within a supply system that delivered 4.5 million tons of fuel to Europe between D-Day and VE Day. When a Sherman company needed fuel, tank trucks brought it forward. When tank trucks proved insufficient, engineers laid pipeline. When pipeline could not reach forward positions, transport aircraft dropped fuel in 5-gallon cans. The American military had industrialized not just production but logistics itself, creating a system where material abundance became a weapon as potent as any gun. German tankers who encountered Shermans in North Africa, Italy, and France initially felt a grim confidence. The technical specifications favored German armor. The Tiger's frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick, angled at precise degrees to deflect incoming rounds. The Sherman's frontal armor reached only 63 millimeters at its thickest point, barely adequate against the high-velocity guns the Germans fielded. In a one-on-one duel at medium range, German tanks possessed devastating advantages. Veterans of these encounters recorded victories in their after-action reports. 3 Shermans destroyed, 4, sometimes 5 in a single engagement before being forced to retreat under overwhelming numbers. But warfare is not conducted as a series of duels. It is decided by the accumulated weight of countless small factors: the availability of spare parts, the presence of artillery support, the reliability of radio communications, the knowledge that losses could be replaced. German tank commanders fought knowing that each vehicle destroyed represented an irreplaceable asset. The Tiger knocked out on Monday morning would not be replaced by Wednesday afternoon. The crew lost could not be regenerated from an endless reserve of trained personnel. Each battle became a calculation of diminishing resources, each victory purchased at a cost that could not be sustained. American commanders fought differently. The loss of 3 Shermans, while tragic for the crews involved, represented a tactical inconvenience rather than strategic catastrophe. Replacement tanks would arrive within days. Replacement crews had been training in the United States, learning their trade on vehicles identical to those they would crew in combat. The production system that had generated the original tanks continued without pause, feeding a pipeline that stretched from Michigan to the front lines. American officers learned to accept losses that would have paralyzed a German formation because they understood the fundamental arithmetic of industrial war. That victory belonged not to the army that lost the fewest tanks, but to the army that could sustain its operations despite losses. This realization came slowly to German defenders, revealing itself through accumulated experience rather than sudden revelation. In Normandy, during the weeks following D-Day, German panzer divisions launched fierce counterattacks against the Allied beachhead. They fought with tactical skill honed through years of combat, employing terrain with expertise, concentrating force at decisive points. They destroyed hundreds of Allied tanks. And yet the invasion continued. Each morning revealed new Sherman columns rolling inland, new concentrations of armor supporting infantry advances. The beaches became industrial ports where Liberty ships unloaded tanks directly onto French soil, where repair depots rebuilt damaged vehicles, where the entire machinery of American production projected itself across the Atlantic Ocean into the heart of Europe. Hauptmann Friedrich von Kluge commanded a Panther company during the Normandy campaign. His diary, recovered after the war, records a growing sense of unreality. He wrote of engagements where his company destroyed enemy tanks at impressive ratios, only to face larger enemy formations the following day. He described the sound that came to haunt German positions, the grinding of multiple engines, not the roar of a single powerful tank, but the collective rumble of dozens moving in coordination. He noted how American tanks operated differently than Soviet or British armor. They advanced not with reckless courage but with methodical determination, willing to absorb losses, willing to probe for weaknesses, backed always by artillery that seemed never to exhaust its ammunition. In his final entry before being killed during an Allied artillery barrage, von Kluge wrote a single sentence that captured the despair settling over German armored forces. "We are fighting not an army, but a factory that produces soldiers and steel without end. The Sherman's design philosophy extended beyond mere mechanical simplicity. It reflected a democratic approach to warfare that contrasted sharply with German military culture. Where the Wehrmacht emphasized hierarchy and specialized expertise, the American Army created weapons that ordinary citizens could learn to operate with reasonable training. The Sherman's controls were labeled in English, its operation documented in manuals written in plain language rather than technical jargon. The driver's position accommodated men of average height and build, not the specific physical requirements that limited crew selection for some German tanks. The gun sight, while less sophisticated than German optics, provided adequate accuracy in the hands of a trained but not exceptional gunner. This accessibility meant that America could transform its civilian population into tank crews with remarkable speed. Young men from farms and factories, from cities and small towns, men who had never given thought to military service before Pearl Harbor, learned to operate complex machines of war in training facilities scattered across the United States. They trained on the same model of tank they would take into combat. When they arrived in Europe or the Pacific, the vehicle felt familiar because it was identical to the Sherman they had driven through Texas dust or Georgia mud during training exercises. Muscle memory translated directly from training ground to battlefield. This standardization, boring, unglamorous, entirely pragmatic, created an army that could replace combat losses not just in equipment, but in trained personnel. German tank crews, by contrast, trained on whatever vehicles remained available behind the lines. A gunner might learn his trade on a Panzer III, only to be assigned to a Panther in combat. A driver might train on one model and fight in another, each with different control layouts, different maintenance requirements, different operational characteristics. The German emphasis on quality produced magnificent weapons but created a system dependent on exceptional individuals. When those veterans fell in combat, replacing them became increasingly difficult. New crews lacked the experience of their predecessors. Tanks sat unused not from lack of equipment, but from lack of trained personnel. The system began consuming itself, unable to regenerate losses at the rate combat demanded. The Sherman's mechanical reliability proved equally revolutionary. American designers had not created a tank immune to breakdown. Such a vehicle remained impossible. But they had created one that broke down predictably and could be repaired quickly. The Continental R975 engine, despite its aviation heritage making it somewhat tall and increasing the Sherman's profile, ran for hundreds of miles between major maintenance. When it did require service, the engine could be removed and replaced as a complete unit in a matter of hours. German tanks, particularly the later Panthers and Tigers, suffered chronic mechanical problems. The Panther's transmission frequently failed under the stress of the vehicle's weight. The Tiger's interleaved road wheels, while providing excellent weight distribution, became clogged with mud and ice, freezing solid in Russian winters and requiring hours of maintenance to free. Complex systems that looked impressive on engineering diagrams became nightmares in field conditions. American maintenance philosophy embraced a principle that seemed almost wasteful to German observers. When something broke, replace the entire assembly rather than attempting field repairs. A Sherman with transmission problems received a new transmission. A tank with engine trouble received a new engine. The damaged components went back to rear area depots where specialists rebuilt them under controlled conditions, then returned them to forward supply dumps. This approach required enormous logistical infrastructure, warehouses full of spare parts, transportation to move components forward, mechanics trained in rapid replacement procedures. But it kept tanks operational. A Sherman that threw a track could be back in action within an hour. A Panther with similar damage might require a full day's work, and that assumed the necessary spare parts were available. The winter of 1944 brought these differences into stark clarity. When Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive that Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, German planners counted on capturing American fuel supplies to sustain their advance. The operation's success depended not on German logistics, which could not adequately supply the offensive, but on seizing enemy supplies. This plan revealed the desperate situation facing the Wehrmacht. They had designed an offensive that required stealing fuel from the enemy to continue operating. When American units retreated in good order, destroying supply dumps before they could be captured, the German advance began running out of fuel within days. Tanks that penetrated deep into American lines sat abandoned when their fuel tanks ran dry. The magnificent Tigers and Panthers, technically superior in almost every measure, became stationary monuments to the futility of quality without quantity. American forces, after the initial shock of the German attack, responded with the industrial solution they had perfected. Replacement tanks arrived from depots in France. Entire divisions repositioned with a speed that German staff officers found incomprehensible. How could an entire armored division move hundreds of kilometers in winter conditions within 48 hours? The answer lay in American trucks, American fuel, American roads maintained by American engineers. The Sherman tanks that counterattacked into the German salient came not as scattered survivors, but as organized formations, supplied, refueled, rearmed. Patton's Third Army pivoted 90 degrees in winter conditions and struck the German flank, achieving in days what German planners had considered impossible. The symbolic weight of the Sherman extended beyond its battlefield performance. To American crews, it represented a connection to home, to the industrial civilization they were fighting to defend. The tank's radial engine sounded like the aircraft engines many had heard at county fairs before the war. Its controls felt similar to the tractors farm boys had operated since childhood. The ammunition storage, while criticized for being vulnerable to fire, reflected American assumptions about logistics, that ammunition existed in such quantities that conserving space mattered less than ease of loading. Every aspect of the Sherman's design whispered the same message. You come from a nation of such abundance that we can afford to build these by the tens of thousands, to ship them across oceans, to replace them when they are lost. German soldiers encountered this abundance with growing horror. Prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge spoke of their shock at American field kitchens, at the quantities of food available to ordinary soldiers, at the casual waste of materials that Germans would have carefully conserved. They saw Sherman tanks and recognized them not as superior weapons, but as symbols of an industrial capacity so vast that Germany could never match it. Some German officers had visited the United States during the 1930s. They had toured American factories, seen the Detroit assembly lines, observed the casual efficiency with which American industry produced automobiles by the millions. They had filed reports noting American industrial capacity, but they had not truly understood, could not truly understand, what it meant until they saw that capacity turned to purposes of war. The Sherman became the vehicle that taught the Wehrmacht the difference between industrial capacity and industrial mobilization. America possessed the capacity before the war, the factories, the workers, the resources. After Pearl Harbor, it achieved mobilization, the transformation of that capacity into focused military production. This distinction proved decisive. Germany had mobilized early, turning its economy toward war production in the mid-1930s. By 1942, it was already operating at near maximum capacity, unable to significantly increase output without sacrificing quality or reducing production in other areas. America, entering the war later, could expand production dramatically because its peacetime economy had operated far below maximum capacity. There existed slack in the system, unused potential that could be activated. The result was a production miracle that still seems barely credible. The United States built not only tanks but everything else simultaneously: cargo ships, bombers, fighters, trucks, artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, uniforms, boots, medical supplies. The factories producing Shermans represented only a fraction of American war production. While churning out tanks, America also built over 2,000 Liberty ships, over 300,000 aircraft, over 2 million trucks. It produced so much rubber that synthetic rubber plants ran at partial capacity. It generated so much aluminum that the metal became almost casual in its applications. It manufactured so many radios that every tank, every plane, every command vehicle could maintain constant communication. German industry, by contrast, made agonizing choices about resource allocation. Steel that went into tank armor could not become U-boat hulls. Copper required for artillery shells meant less copper for electrical systems. The Germans attempted to maintain quality while expanding quantity, an approach that resulted in doing neither optimally. Late-war German tanks incorporated sophisticated technology, infrared night vision systems, advanced fire control mechanisms that would have been impressive in small numbers but became liabilities when production demands required simpler, faster manufacturing processes. The Panther tank underwent continuous modification and improvement, each variant supposedly better than the last, but each change disrupted production and required new parts, new tools, new training. The Sherman, by contrast, maintained basic design consistency even as it evolved. The M4, M4A1, M4A2, and M4A3 variants used different engines and featured minor modifications, but a crew trained on one variant could operate another with minimal adaptation. The famous 76mm gun that appeared in late-war Shermans provided better anti-tank performance without requiring complete redesign of the vehicle. The mechanical systems remained familiar. This consistency meant that the production system could refine and accelerate without constant retooling. It meant that spare parts inventories remained valid across variants. It meant that improvements could be incorporated gradually without disrupting the flow of tanks to the front. By early 1945, the strategic situation had become mathematically unsustainable for Germany. American and British forces approached the Rhine from the west. Soviet armies drove toward Berlin from the east. In both theaters, Sherman tanks formed the spearhead of Allied advances, American Shermans in the west, British Shermans in Italy, Soviet Shermans delivered through Lend-Lease in the east. The same basic design, adapted to different armies, different climates, different tactical doctrines. Over 4,000 Shermans went to the Soviet Union alone, contributing to the great offensives that pushed German forces back toward their pre-war borders. British and Commonwealth forces operated thousands more, modifying them to fit their tactical preferences, adding heavier guns, adapting them to specialized roles, creating variants for specific missions. This adaptability revealed another Sherman advantage: the design's ability to serve as a platform for modification. The British created the Sherman Firefly by fitting a 17-pounder anti-tank gun, transforming a mediocre tank destroyer into an excellent one. Engineers modified Shermans into mine-clearing flails, into armored recovery vehicles, into bridge layers and flamethrower tanks. The basic chassis proved strong enough to accept modifications while maintaining reliability. This versatility meant that the Sherman remained relevant even as battlefield conditions evolved. When a new threat emerged, a fortified position, a minefield, a requirement for specialized capability, the solution often involved modifying existing Shermans rather than designing entirely new vehicles. German defenders in the final months of the war faced not merely military defeat but psychological collapse. They had been promised wonder weapons, jet fighters, super heavy tanks, guided missiles that would turn the tide of battle. Some of these weapons appeared in limited numbers. They were impressive technically. They changed nothing strategically. For every German jet fighter that briefly challenged Allied air superiority, hundreds of conventional Allied aircraft maintained control of the skies. For every King Tiger tank that dominated a local battlefield, dozens of Shermans bypassed the threat and continued advancing. The wonder weapons revealed themselves as desperation measures, attempts to achieve through technological brilliance what could no longer be accomplished through industrial capacity. The young German soldier manning a Panzerfaust in Berlin's rubble in April 1945 understood something his commanders had been slow to accept. The individual technical merit of weapons mattered less than the system that produced and sustained them. His handheld anti-tank weapon might destroy a Sherman at close range. He might even destroy several. But behind those tanks came more tanks, and behind those came infantry, and behind them came artillery, and supporting them came aircraft, and supplying them came trucks, and coordinating them came radios, and producing all of it came factories that had never stopped running. He faced not an army but an industrial system that had mechanized warfare itself, that had reduced battle to a production problem and solved it with assembly lines. The Sherman that finally broke through the last German defenses did so not because it was invincible, but because it was inevitable. It represented the transformation of warfare from an art practiced by military specialists into an industrial process executed by democratic societies. The tank itself was ordinary, good enough in most measures, inferior in some, superior in few, but it arrived in such quantities, supported by such infrastructure, backed by such industrial depth, that technical inferiority became irrelevant. Quality had met quantity, and quantity had won not through individual superiority but through cumulative, overwhelming, inexorable presence. After the war, military analysts studied the Sherman's combat record with mixed conclusions. In direct combat against German heavy tanks, it suffered unfavorable loss ratios. A Tiger or Panther could destroy multiple Shermans before being knocked out. This led some critics to condemn the Sherman as a death trap, a mediocre design that sacrificed American lives to industrial convenience. These criticisms contained truth but missed the larger context. The question was never whether the Sherman could defeat a Tiger in single combat, but whether the Sherman achieved strategic objectives. By that measure, it succeeded completely. The Sherman allowed American forces to project armored power across two oceans simultaneously. It enabled the reconquest of Western Europe. It contributed to the defeat of Japan in the Pacific. It armed Free French units that liberated their homeland. It equipped British forces in Italy and Northwest Europe. It served in Soviet units pushing through Eastern Europe. No other tank in history has been produced in such quantities, served in so many armies, fought across such varied terrain, or remained in service for so long after the war. The design's very ordinariness, its refusal to pursue technical perfection at the cost of production capacity, proved to be its greatest strength. In the decades following 1945, military theorists would debate the lessons of industrial warfare. Some argued that the Sherman vindicated mass production over craftsmanship. Others contended that better design might have achieved victory with fewer casualties. Both perspectives contained partial truth. But the deeper lesson concerned the relationship between military tools and the societies that produced them. The Sherman succeeded not merely because American factories could build thousands of tanks, but because American society possessed the economic depth, the logistical infrastructure, the technological base, and the political will to sustain that production while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. German military excellence in 1945 resembled a fine blade that had been shattered against an anvil. The blade's quality was undeniable, sharp, precisely tempered, crafted with skill. But the anvil simply absorbed the blows, its massive solidity representing accumulated industrial capacity that could not be defeated through tactical brilliance alone. The Sherman was not a blade, but part of the anvil, one component of a system so vast, so robust, so deeply rooted in industrial civilization that it could sustain losses that would have broken smaller nations. On May 6, 1945, Sherman tanks occupied Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, cities that 4 years earlier had seemed untouchable. They sat in Vienna and Prague, in towns whose names few Americans could pronounce, in village squares where children approached cautiously to offer flowers and beg for chocolate. The tanks idled at intersections while their crews rested, and in that idling could be heard not the roar of a superweapon but the steady rumble of mass production. The sound spoke of factories in Michigan and Pennsylvania, of assembly lines that had never stopped moving, of cargo ships that had crossed the Atlantic countless times, of a supply system that had treated an entire continent as its operational theater. And in the silence that followed Germany's surrender, as the guns fell quiet and the exhausted soldiers tried to comprehend that they had survived, the Sherman tank revealed its final truth. It had not been designed to inspire awe or fear. It had been designed to be built in quantities sufficient to defeat industrialized tyranny. It had been created not as a symbol of American technological supremacy, but as proof of American industrial democracy, the idea that a free society properly mobilized could outproduce and outlast any totalitarian state regardless of that state's initial military advantages. The tank's riveted hull, its ordinary engine, its adequate armor, all spoke to a democratic faith in the power of collective effort over individual excellence, of sustained production over brilliant improvisation, of systems over heroes. The Sherman could not be stopped because it represented something more fundamental than steel and machinery. It embodied the industrial capacity of a continental economy that had turned its full attention to the problem of mechanized warfare and solved it not through genius innovation, but through the grinding logic of mass production. Each tank that rolled off an assembly line carried with it the accumulated weight of America's Industrial Revolution, the lessons Henry Ford had learned producing Model Ts, the systems developed by Frederick Winslow Taylor to maximize efficiency, the natural resources of a continent, the technical education of a population, the transportation infrastructure that moved goods from coast to coast. All of this focused and directed toward a single purpose. In the end, the German soldier in his foxhole learned what the Japanese defender in his bunker would soon discover, that they faced not merely a better equipped enemy but an entirely different kind of war. A war where material abundance became a weapon as devastating as any gun. A war where the capacity to replace losses mattered more than the ability to avoid them. A war where the grinding arithmetic of production defeated the calculus of tactical brilliance. The Sherman tank was the messenger that delivered this truth, arriving in such numbers that its message could not be ignored, could not be countered, could not be stopped. It rolled forward not with the elegance of a perfectly crafted weapon, but with the inevitability of historical forces that no amount of courage or skill could ultimately resist. And in its ordinary steel frame was written the story of how industrial democracy defeated military autocracy, how quantity achieved what quality alone could not, how the steady accumulation of advantage, mile by mile, tank by tank, day by day, crushed armies that had once seemed invincible.